lie behind what we see on our television screens and computer monitors, what we find in our shopping centers, what our children are being taught in their classrooms, what our leaders announce and implement? Could they lie behind the current events, news, and movements of our times, and behind what is even now influencing our lives without our realizing it? Is it possible that one of these ancient entities once paid a visit to New York City and started a cultural revolution that is still transforming our world? Who are the possessor, the enchantress, the destroyer, and the transformer? And what do they have to do with what is now taking place in our culture? Could there be a mystery that lies behind and explains the sign of the rainbow and the reason it is now saturating our culture? And could that mystery go back to the temples of ancient Mesopotamia? Could the mystery of the gods have actually determined the outcomes and timing of Supreme Court rulings down to their exact days? Is it possible that the dynamics of ancient mythology have actually played out in our public squares and on our city streets in real time? Could these gods or beings actually be the unseen movers and catalysts of modern culture? Could they, even now, at this moment, be at work transforming the modern world beyond recognition? What is it all leading to? We will now embark on a journey beginning with the ancient entities known as the Shadim. We will remove the veil to uncover the first and most important revelation underlying the mystery of the gods. We will see the ancient transformation concerning the gods that changed world history. We will open up a 2,000-year-old warning involving a house of spirits and what it foretells concerning the modern world. We will then see how the gods of the ancient mystery have come into our world. We will uncover the Dark Trinity and how it has changed our culture. We will reveal how the gods are working and moving in all that is taking place around us, how they are initiating social upheavals and cultural revolutions, indwelling our politics, transforming our world, and even our lives. Finally, we will open up the meaning and significance of it all, what it portends, what it will lead to, and what we need to know and do in light of it. A warning. The mystery revealed in this book will touch the sacred cows of our culture and age. It will broach that which is deemed unbroachable, speak that which is judged as unspeakable, question the unquestionable, and reveal that which has not yet been revealed. It will address the most radical and controversial issues of our time, the front lines of cultural upheaval, the catalytic forces that are now transforming society, civilization, history, and life as these have been known. As it progresses, the mystery will become more intense and more explosive. Thus, the latter part of the revelation will be even more so than the first. At the same time, it will touch these sacred cows and issues in a way in which they are not normally touched, illuminated by the light of a mystery that goes back ages to ancient times. What one does with the revelations is in one's own court. The purpose of this book is to reveal them. Chapter 2. The Return of the Gods. The gods have returned. They had been away for ages. The ancients had exiled them. They wandered the barren and desolate places, the deserts and wildernesses, the alleyways and ruins, the graves and sepulchres. They haunted the underground, the dark realms of the forbidden, the taboo, and the dead. They inhabited the shadows of the outer darkness. In their days of glory, they had reigned over tribes and nations, kingdoms and empires. They had subjugated cultures and mastered civilizations, infusing them with their spirits, saturating them with their images, possessing them. They sat enthroned in marble temples and shrines of wood and stone, by hallowed trees and rivers, in sacred groves and in mountaintop sanctuaries. Their statues and carved images looked down at their worshippers who approached their altars. bowed down before them. Priests sang their praises and performed their rituals. Armies set off to war and laid cities to waste in their names. And children, the rich and the poor, the free and the slave alike, exalted them, worshipped them, entreated their favor, invoked their powers, danced to the drumbeat of their festivals, dreamed of them, loved them, served them, dreaded them, became entranced and seized by them. But the days of their dominion came to an end. They were expelled from the high places, banished from the palaces of kings, driven out of the public squares, cast out of their temples, and removed from the lives of their subjects. Their groves were neglected, their shrines abandoned, their altars left in disrepair, and their sanctuaries in ruins. No longer were they worshipped or feared. No longer were their hymns sung, their festivals partaken in, or their holy days observed. No longer were they believed in. The gods were sent into exile. In time, they became memories, echoes, and phantoms. And then they were forgotten. In the days of their absence, kingdoms had risen and fallen, nations had disappeared, an empire had collapsed, and a new civilization had been born. The world they had left had disappeared. In its place had risen another that was altogether foreign to them. In their absence, man had charted the earth, vanquished nature, dissected the fabric of life, and codified the universe. The forests were no longer enchanted, the shrines were no longer sacred, and nature was no longer magical. The scientist now wore the mantle of the prophet, and the garments of the priest had been replaced by lab coats. The world had been disenchanted. It was then, having demystified the earth and awash in his newfound powers, that man decided he had no need of any god. And it was then and by that the ancient door was set ajar. The long-locked portal of the gods was reopened. Thus was their conjuring, their invocation, and their return. And so it began. They came back from the desolate places and from the dark and forbidden realms. They came up from the underground and from the dwelling places of the dead. They stepped out from the shadows. They came slowly at first, as the door had at first only been slightly opened. Had their entrance been too rapid, it would have been repelled, and the door would have closed. But by entering with measured steps, they were able to keep the door ajar and then open it still wider. And as the shock that followed each of their steps dissipated, the resistance to their return would be overcome. The world they now entered was unlike the one they had left. In the former world, cities glowed with the light of oil lamps and walls were adorned with carved images. But in the world they entered, cities were illuminated with electrical currents and images of light moved across billboards and movie screens, television sets, and computer monitors. The gods could not rule over the modern world as they had over the ancient, not in the same way. But they would rule over it. They would not return to the high places and groves or to their ancient shrines and temples. They would inhabit the new seats of power by which the modern world was led and make of them their thrones. They would come upon the movers and influencers of modern culture and make of them their instruments. To gain dominion over the modern world, they could not appear as they had in ancient times. Though there was still a remnant of those who worshipped them and who called them by name, they were of the fringe. To the modern mind, the gods did not exist, and few would serve them if they believed they did. So the gods came back in disguise. They altered their appearances. They took on new identities and gave themselves new names. They came as spirits of enlightenment, freedom, and power. They came as secular gods, new gods, alternate gods, gods that granted godhood, gods that denied that they were gods, and gods that declared that there were no gods. They came as gods of the modern world. And so the gods returned. And having returned, They began working their dark magic, prodding and impelling, tempting and seducing, drawing away, uprooting what was planted and planting what was not, overturning, transforming, moving the ancient markers, breaking down the ancient hedges, and forcing open the ancient gates. And as the seeds of their planting came to fruition, and their spirits infused more and more of the modern world, they grew still more powerful. And so the gods now dwell among us. They inhabit our institutions, walk the halls of our governments, cast votes in our legislatures, guide our corporations, gaze out from our skyscrapers, perform on our stages, and teach in our universities. They saturate our media, direct our news cycles, inspire our entertainments, and give voices to our songs. They perform on our stages, in our theaters and stadiums. They light up our television sets and computer screens. They incite new movements and ideologies and convert others to their ends. They instruct our children and initiate them into their ways. They incite the multitudes. They drive otherwise rational people into irrationality, and some into frenzies, just as they had done in ancient times. They demand our worship, our veneration, our submission, and our sacrifices. The gods are everywhere. They have permeated our culture. They have mastered our civilization. The gods are here. To begin the mystery of the gods, we must go back to ancient times and to the entities known as the Shadim. Part 2. The Spirits. Chapter 3. The Shadim. The gods were everywhere. Planet of the gods. They haunted the ancient world. The fact that in the past 2,000 years they have not been everywhere is an exception to the rule. For most of recorded history, the gods were in every land and enthroned on the pinnacle of every major culture and civilization, from the god Enlil of Sumer to Ra of Egypt, Amarok of the Arctic, Kukulkan of Central America, Wotan of Northern Europe, Dionysus of Greece, Obatala of Africa, Tiamat of Babylon, Bicha of China, Oro of Polynesia, Ahura Mazda of Persia, Perun of Russia, Shamash of Assyria, Dagda of Ireland, Juno of Rome, Shiva of India, and a countless multitude of others. Wherever there were people, there were gods. They reigned over nations, over cities, over cultures, over nature, over the underworld, and over the heavenlies. Their presence permeated the lives of their subjects. The people were bound to them. That the gods could appear in every land, transcending the many differences, distinctions, and barriers of culture, to become a near universal part of human life, is a strange and peculiar phenomenon. To modern sensibilities, the phenomenon of the gods is the product of man's imagination, his projections, his fears, desires, and fantasies. That is certainly part of the story. But what if there was more to it? What if there was another dynamic in the mix, another realm? The Devastators. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses speaks of a people departing from God and turning elsewhere. They sacrificed to Shadim, not to God, to gods they did not know, to new gods that had come. In turning away from God, they worship other gods. Those other gods are identified as the Shadim. In all the Hebrew scriptures, the word appears only once more in the book of Psalms. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to Shadim. The word Shadim, again, stands for the gods and idols of the nations that the people of Israel turned to when they turned away from God. What does it mean? Shadim comes from the Hebrew root word shud, which means to act violently, to lay waste, to devastate, that which brings destruction. In ancient Babylonian writings, the word shadim or shadu speaks of spirits, protective or malevolent. The latter case would match the root word from which the word shadim derives. A malevolent spirit would lay waste and devastate and bring destruction. The daimonia. When the ancient Jewish scholars rendered the Hebrew Bible into Greek, in a translation known as the Septuagint, they had to find the right word in Greek to stand for shadim. The word they used could refer to a spirit, a principality, an occult entity, a god. The word was daimonian. It is from this that we get the word demon, a malevolent or evil spirit. In the Jewish world, the shadim are demonic spirits. So the Septuagint translates Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 17 this way. They sacrificed to daimonios, not to God, but to gods they did not know, to new gods that had come to them. And Psalm 106 verses 36 through 37 is rendered, they served their idols, which became a trap for them. They even sacrificed their sons and daughters to daimonios. Writing to the believers in the city of Corinth, the Apostle Paul spoke of the sacrifices offered up on the altars of the Gentile or pagan world. The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to daimonia and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with daimonia. So Paul writes that when the Gentiles offered their sacrifices to their gods, they were actually offering them to the daimonia, the same word used in the Septuagint to stand for the Hebrew shadim, the dark or malevolent spirits. The ancient Greeks viewed the daimonia much the same way that the Babylonians viewed demons, as spirits that could be good or evil, while in the Bible the word is used only to signify spirits of evil. The words of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians are strikingly similar to the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 and of the psalmist in Psalm 106. All three scriptures speak of the spirits, the shadim, the daimonia, as being worshipped and offered sacrifices. In Deuteronomy and Psalms, those sacrificing to the shadim are Israelites who have turned away from God. In 1 Corinthians, those sacrificing to the daimonia are of the pagan world. The entities. All three reveal a connection that is far-reaching and profound. When the Israelites offered up their children as sacrifices, they were doing so on the altars of specific gods. Likewise, the idols to which the Gentile world offered up sacrifices represented specific deities, gods of the pagan world. In other words, the gods of ancient Canaan and Phoenicia to which the Israelites sacrificed were not simply the figments of pagan imagination, but actual spiritual entities. Likewise, the gods that the Gentiles worshipped and sacrificed to in the 1st century Roman Empire, gods with such names as Jupiter, Apollo, Vesta, and Bacchus, were not simply the imagined or invented characters of pagan mythology, but were connected to spiritual entities, the daimonia, demonic spirits. From the Old Testament Hebrew to the New Testament Greek, the revelation is clear and consistent. Behind the gods of the pagan world were the shadim, the daimonia, the spirits. Worship is connected to spirituality. Spirituality is connected to the spirit, or to spirits. And spirits, as revealed in the Bible, can be either of light or of darkness. Spirits of light are called angels. Spirits of darkness are called demons. And while angelic entities are, by nature, joined to the worship of God, demonic entities are, by nature, at war with the worship of God. They would thus lead one away from the worship of God, even if through the means and form of other gods. The ancient key. Could that which the scriptures reveal about the Shadim and the Daimonia provide the key to the phenomenon and mystery of the gods? Could it be the reason behind their universality? Why they have transcended the vast spectrum of human culture and have manifested in every land on Earth? Could it be the key behind the many similarities and convergences between the cult of the gods and the world of the occult, the overlapping of the ancient pagan rites to the gods and witchcraft? This is not, of course, to suggest that mythology is real. Mythology is mythology. But is it possible that the mythological worlds of pagan worship, again, we see the mystery of the Shadim and the Daimonia, the gods and the spirits moved as one? Mass phenomenon. This opens up an even larger truth. If the oracles, the high priests, and the priestesses were possessed of the spirits, and they were each the highest vessels of their nation's spirituality, then what about their nation? The dominion of the gods and spirits was never confined to the temples and shrines. It permeated entire cultures and civilizations. The deity was not worshipped only in their temples and shrines, but in their homes, workplaces, marketplaces, fields, mountains, and valleys. The majority of their worshippers were not priests or officiants, but farmers, shepherds, potters, traders, everyday men, women, and children. So, if the culture or kingdom worshipped the gods, and the gods were spirits, then the culture and kingdom were joined to the spirits, subject to them, and under their dominion. The signs of possession were not confined to the priesthood or temple. The shakings, the convulsions, and the violent frenzies could manifest anywhere at any time and with anyone. A civilization possessed. Beyond the signs of individual possession were other signs and symptoms of a much larger phenomenon. In pagan culture, it was not uncommon for people to offer up other people as sacrifices to the gods. In some pagan cultures, people even murdered their own children in sacrifice to the gods. They did so as acts of worship. Such things were not the spontaneous acts of a possessed individual, but the ways, traditions, rituals, and collective acts of a possessed culture. The larger truth is that possession may involve more than an individual. It may involve an entire culture, nation, kingdom, or civilization. It is this phenomenon, that of collective, mass, or civilizational possession, that is critical to understand if one is to understand the radical metamorphosis that took place in ancient times, that altered world history, and the equally radical transformation taking place at this very moment. In the 1st century, in an unlikely place, a peripheral land of the Roman Empire known as Judea, an unlikely revolution was begun. It would change the history of the gods and of the world itself. We now journey to that unlikely place and that unlikely phenomenon that brought about the twilight of the gods. Chapter 5. Twilight of the Gods. 2,000 years ago, in the midst of the Greco-Roman world, in the heartland of Galilee, in the hilltop village of Nazareth, there appeared a Jewish man named Yeshua, who would become known to much of the world as Jesus. He came as the long-prophesied Redeemer, the Messiah of Israel, and the light of the world. He would, in time, become the central figure of human history. The Galilean. The The earliest accounts of his ministry record his performing miracles in the sight of the Judean multitudes. The lame walked, the blind received sight, and the lepers were healed. Another miracle of healing that he was recorded to have performed was described by the Greek word ekbalo. Ekbalo means to expel, to eject, to cast out, to send away. The Bible records several encounters between Jesus and those possessed or demonized by unclean spirits. In each case, he cast out the demonic spirit. In each case, the person was set free, healed, and restored to his or her right mind. Before the end of his ministry on earth, he imparted the same power of ekbalo, the casting out of spirits, to his disciples. Emanation. In the 4th decade of the 1st century, the message of forgiveness, salvation, and eternal life in the death and resurrection of the Messiah, Yeshua, or Jesus, the message that would become known as the Gospel, went forth from the city of Jerusalem. It spread first throughout the land of Judea. Then it went into the nations, to the Gentiles. The gospel and the word of God had crossed into the pagan world. That crossing would change the course of world history. The message of God now entered the lands of many gods and idols. The ways of God now touched the ways of the pagan world. The word of God now touched the realm of mythology. The Spirit of God now moved through the world of spirits, and the disciples of God now moved through the dominion of the Shadim, the Daimonia. Clash of the gods. If behind the gods were principalities, then when the two worlds met, we would expect an intense conflict, and that is exactly what took place. It was a clash of spirits. The book of Acts records several of those first clashes. In the city of Philippi, a woman possessed with the spirit of divination stalked the apostle Paul and his co-worker Silas for days. Luke, the writer of the account, uses the Greek word python or python to describe the possessing spirit. It is the same word used to identify the oracle of Delphi and the spirit that possessed her, and the god behind the spirit that possessed her. After several days of being followed or stalked, the Apostle Paul cast the spirit out of the woman. It was that casting out of the spirit that led to a violent backlash. The crowds went into an uproar. The two disciples were arrested, beaten, and imprisoned. Their imprisonment only came to an end when an earthquake shook the prison to its foundations. In the city of Ephesus, where the disciples proclaimed the word, performed miracles of healing, and cast out the spirits, the conflict between the gospel and the gods led to a dangerous confrontation. The idol makers of Ephesus stirred up the multitude into a fury against the word and faith that was being proclaimed. The violent rage was centered on the city's patron goddess, whom they believed was threatened by the new message and faith. The crowd chanted the name of the goddess over and over again as it sought to exact vengeance against the disciples. Fury of the gods. The rage of the pagan world against the gospel would grow so fierce that in time, believers would be imprisoned, crucified, burned, and sent into the arenas to be killed as entertainment before cheering spectators. The fury of the gods and the ferocity of the spirits were now deadly. In the early years of the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Diocletian launched what would become known as the Great Persecution. The number of Christians arrested became so great that common criminals had to be released from Roman prisons in order to make room. Beyond imprisonment, Diocletian's persecution would lead to the torture and execution of countless believers in Jesus. The Great Persecution its deadly fury was rooted in the gods. It was launched on the day called Terminalia, the festival of the Roman god Terminus, lord of boundaries and endings. The persecution was intended to bring about the end of faith in Jesus and the termination of his followers. Christians would be commanded to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods. If they refused, they would be imprisoned or killed. The Oracle's War. But there is a story behind the story. The Great Persecution had its origin in the city of Didyma, in the hilltop Temple of Apollo by the Aegean Sea. It was there that the Emperor Diocletian sent a delegation to have an audience with the temple's oracle. It was believed that the gods were angry at the new faith. It was believed that the gospel was interfering with the ability of the gods to transmit prophecies to their priests and priestesses. The delegation came with a question for the oracle. The emperor wanted to know whether he should launch a persecution against them. The oracle's response gave Diocletian the answer he needed. He was to make war against the believers and the new faith. So the greatest persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire was launched by a woman possessed by a spirit, one of the Shadim, the Daemonia, the spirit of a pagan god. The Great Exorcism. In the end, it was not the gods that prevailed, or the might of the Roman Empire, or the words of the oracle. Against all odds, the overwhelmingly powerless followers of the crucified Redeemer overcame the fires of persecution, and the message of the gospel of God's love and forgiveness overcame the reign of the gods. The polytheism and pantheism of the Greco-Roman world gave way to the belief in one God, and the mythological consciousness of ancient paganism yielded to the Word of God and to a salvation that had manifested in time and space. Myth yielded to history. The spell of the gods was broken. The skies were no longer filled with their thrones, and the earth was no longer their haunting ground. Their names no longer inspired fear and awe. Their festivals attracted fewer and fewer worshippers. Their shrines were abandoned. Their temples fell into ruin. It was the twilight of the gods. But if behind the gods were the spirits, then when the spell of the gods was broken, we would expect the signs of possession to dissipate. And so they did. The frenzied spirit possessions of the pagan priests, priestesses, oracles, and worshippers became an increasingly rare phenomenon. The carnal and licentious acts of pagan worship and rituals were banned from the public sphere, and human sacrifice became a distant memory. The breaking of the spell. The breaking of the spell and its repercussions went far beyond the realm of pagan worship. The degradation of human life that was typical of paganism yielded before the new belief that life was sacred. The individual was also sacred, and so possessed immutable rights. Women were likewise sacred, and were to be treated as equal heirs of the kingdom. And the poor and the weak were no less created in the image of God than were the rich and powerful. They were to be treated accordingly as equals. Every life was now of inestimable value and equally precious in the sight of God. Every realm of society was affected. Sexuality was now to be treated as a sacred gift from God, to be honored and kept in the equally sacred vessel of marriage. As for little children, they were no longer to be abused or mistreated. To take their lives because they were unwanted was now a crime. As for emperors and rulers, governments and kingdoms, they could no longer claim the authority of godhood. They too were subject to God's laws and standards, as was everyone. So the twilight of the gods would transform the Roman Empire and Western civilization. The Greek word ekbalo, used in the New Testament to describe Jesus' casting spirits out of individuals, now took on a colossal dimension. The casting out now applied to an entire empire. The gods had been cast out of their temples, their cities and lands, from Western civilization itself. And if behind the gods were the spirits, then the casting out of the gods represented the greatest mass exorcism in world history. My hall has fallen. What happened to the Oracle of Delphi? The pinnacle of pagan revelation and its most exalted case of spirit possession. In the year 362, the pagan Roman emperor, known as Julian the Apostate, attempted to restore the oracle's temple to its former glory. He sent a representative to consult her. She sent back a word that would become known as her last pronouncement. It is recorded that she said this: "Tell the emperor that my hall has fallen to the ground. Phoebus, the god Apollo, no longer has his house, nor his mantic bay, nor his prophetic spring. The water has dried up." The gods had been exiled. The possessing spirits had been cast out. No longer could they take possession as they had in earlier days, nor could they direct empires with their prophetic utterances. Their oracles had grown silent. Exiles and exorcisms. It was an end and a new beginning. The driving out of gods and spirits that took place in the Roman Empire would now take place beyond its borders. It would happen in every place in which the gospel was received. Each time it happened, the signs of possession, individual and civilizational, would begin to disappear. No longer would the Germanic tribes gather in the forests to hang their victims on sacred trees as sacrifices to their god Odin. No longer would the Slavs offer up their prisoners and slaves as sacrifices to their god Perun. And no longer would the Aztecs tear out the beating hearts of their victims in honor of their sun god, Huitzilopochtli. What had happened in the Roman Empire would be repeated throughout the earth. Civilizations were exorcised. The gods lost their hold, and the spirits departed. The phenomenon of a civilization set free from the gods and cleansed of the spirits was something new to world history. It had never before happened. The phenomenon was unique to Western civilization. It would radically alter the course of that civilization and then that of the world itself. The worship of gods may come to an end, but principalities and spirits do not. They go on. What then became of the gods and spirits? And if they did go on, could they not one day return? And if they did return, what would happen? To bring the mystery into modern times, we must uncover one more ancient puzzle piece. Chapter 6. The House of Spirits. Could the last clue be found in an ancient parable? The parable. The final puzzle piece lies in an ancient passage recorded in the New Testament, the words of Yeshua, Jesus, given to his disciples. A parable within which is a revelation of profound, massive, and prophetic ramifications for the modern world and our own day. He said this: "When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places, seeking rest, and finds none. Then he says, 'I will return to my house from which I came.'" What does it mean? And how does it relate to the matter of the gods? And what significance could it contain concerning modern times? The House of Spirits. The passage speaks of a man possessed by an unclean spirit. The man is delivered of that spirit. The spirit then wanders through dry places, presumably the desert, but finds no place to rest. It then decides to return to its house, the formerly possessed man. But when it returns, it finds that its former dwelling place, the man, is empty, swept clean, and set in order. The cleansed state of the vessel leads the spirit to go and bring back 7 other spirits more evil than itself. So the man is now possessed by 7 other spirits in addition to the original one. He is thus now in a worse condition at the end than he was at the beginning. At first glance, it would seem that the parable is talking about a possessed and delivered man who then becomes repossessed. It certainly could be applied to a possessed individual, but the parable is actually not about the man at all. It is only an illustration, an example, an analogy, used to reveal a spiritual principle and give a prophetic warning. Spirits of Rome. The key comes in the last words of the parable. After stating that the last state of that man is worse than the first, Jesus adds, "So shall it also be with this wicked generation." Thus, the parable is not about individual possession, but collective or mass possession. The possession of a generation, a culture, a civilization. The parable's immediate application appears to be the generation that lived in 1st century Judea. But the principles revealed in the parable extend far beyond the age and borders of that nation. They apply to Western civilization as a whole, and span the entire age into the modern world. How so? 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire and Western civilization comprised a house of spirits, a civilization possessed of gods and spirits. But into that house came the Word of God, the Spirit of God, the Gospel. Western civilization was thus set free from the spirits and became, as in the parable, a house set in order, a civilization cleansed. So then what happened to the principalities? The parable answers that. The spirits still exist, but now dwell outside the house. So in the case of Western civilization, the spirits that once possessed it still existed, but now dwelled outside the borders of that civilization. They roamed the dry places, the desolate lands. They dwelled in the shadows. They dwelled in exile. Return of the spirits. The spirit in the parable finds no rest, so it seeks to return to its house to repossess it. When Jesus was about to cast the spirits out of the possessed man known as the demoniac, it is...
Good morning. It's a bit difficult to type and drive at the same time.
Demoniac. It is recorded that the spirits pleaded with him to be cast into a nearby herd of pigs. The spirits are parasitic. They need a host to possess. Thus, the spirits cast out of Western civilization, if they find no rest, if they find no comparable civilization to possess, will seek to return to what they believe is their house. And thus we would expect that the same spirits that once possessed Western civilization would seek to do so again. But the question must be asked. How could the spirit return to the house from which it has been dispossessed? The empty house and the 7 others. It could only do so if the house has become unoccupied, empty, and the door has been left open. The parable continues. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. The house is clean and set in order because of its initial deliverance or exorcism. And yet the implication is that no one is now living there. The house was left empty. Thus, it is open to being reoccupied. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits, more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. Since the house is clean, swept, and in order, the spirit brings in 7 other spirits to join in the repossession. The implication is that if the house had not been cleansed and set in order, the spirits would not have brought back the other spirits to occupy it. The darker state. And therein lies the warning. The house that is cleansed and put in order but remains empty will be repossessed. And if it should be repossessed, it will end up in a worse state than if it had never been cleansed. What happens if we apply this to an entire civilization? It would translate to this: should a culture, a society, a nation, or a civilization be cleansed, exorcised of the gods and spirits, but then remain or become empty, it will be repossessed by the gods and spirits that once possessed it, and more. And it will end up in a far worse state than if it had never been cleansed or exorcised at all. It will, according to the parable, end up many times more possessed and evil than before. The door to repossession. But in the case of Western civilization, how would it happen? How would the spirits re-enter the house from which they were cast out? How would the gods return? In the scriptural accounts of exorcism, the spirits are cast out by the word and power of God, and in the name and authority of Jesus. When the Roman Empire and Western civilization were delivered from the spirits and gods, it happened the same way, by the word and power of God and by the name and authority of Jesus. Therefore, how could the spirits and gods return to Western civilization? Only one way. If that civilization should ever turn away from God, from His Word, from the Gospel, from Christianity, from Jesus, if it should do so, then that which drove out the spirits will no longer be present to protect it against their return, and the civilization that had been delivered of the spirits will become repossessed by them. The gods will return. Pre-Christian versus post-Christian. And what would happen then? According to the parable, the repossessed house will end up far worse than at the beginning. Taken into the realm of world history, it means this: a post-Christian civilization will end up in a far darker state than a pre-Christian civilization. If Western civilization turns away from God, what will come of it will be much darker and far more dangerous than what it was in its days of paganism. It is no accident that the modern world, and not the ancient, has been responsible for unleashing the greatest evils upon the world. And it is no accident that when nations and civilizations that had once known God turned away, when they turned against the Christian faith they had once received, what then came upon them would often be described in terms of the demonic. A pre-Christian civilization may produce a Caligula or a Nero, but a post-Christian civilization will produce a Stalin or a Hitler. A pre-Christian society may give birth to barbarity, but a post-Christian society will give birth to even darker offspring: fascism, communism, and Nazism. A pre-Christian nation may erect an altar of human sacrifice, but a post-Christian nation will build Auschwitz. For a nation or civilization that had once known God, that was once delivered of the gods and spirits, to then turn away from God is a most dangerous thing. The gods will return to it. It is not for us now to open up the mysteries behind the return of the spirits and gods to such nations and powers as the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. But it is for this book to open up the mystery behind the return of the gods and spirits in our own day and to our own culture and civilization. The return of the gods to America and Western civilization, and by these, to the world. It is a mystery that touches all of us, just as the working of the gods and spirits is now touching, altering, and transforming the world around us. If the gods were to return to the modern world and to America, how would they do so? Is there an ancient template that reveals the answer? And what is the Dark Trinity? Part 3. The Dark Trinity. Chapter 7. A word before for the revealing. What we're about to see will touch on subjects, issues, and events that are now impacting the modern world, but it will do so in a new light. There are individuals and groups on every side of every issue. This is not about any individual or group, but about the gods, the spirits, and the principalities. The mystery cannot be directed. It exists apart from anyone's opinion, desire, or will. The chips must fall where the mystery will have them fall. There is no us or them in what is about to be opened. There is only us. The mystery of the gods and the dangers revealed in that mystery apply equally to all and with no distinction. On the walls of the ancient city stood the watchman. If the watchman saw a coming danger, an enemy army, the approach of destruction, it was his charge to sound the alarm and warn the people. If he kept silent, they would perish, and he would be guilty of their blood. The mystery of the gods concerns nations, civilizations, the world, and everyone in it. It speaks of life and death, good and evil, danger and the warning of danger, calamity and redemption. To be aware of such things and not reveal them would be to act as a watchman who sees the approach of danger and keeps silent. It would be a moral breach to not reveal it. At the same time, the revealing of the mystery, as with the sound of a watchman's alarm, will by nature cause a disturbance. No true watchman sounds the trumpet to cause a disturbance. He does so knowing that only by sounding it will those who will awaken, and those who will be saved. The greatest commandment is love. With regard to what is about to be revealed, there is no room for any other response but love and compassion, for we are all in the same boat. We must stand for what is right and against what is not. We must shine the light into the darkness, and we must do it all, manifesting the truth in love. In the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul makes clear a critical distinction. We do not war against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. The book will be the uncovering of those principalities, powers, rulers, and hosts. As they affect all without distinction, and as the issues involved are of life and death, the directive of love is all the more critical. And in this case, love warrants the speaking of truth. Danger warrants the giving of warning. And with regard to the gods, the mystery warrants its revelation. With that said, we now move to its revealing as we open up the mystery of the Dark Trinity. Chapter 8. The Dark Trinity. If the gods were to return, if they were to re-enter Western civilization, how would they do it? And what gods would they be? They would not come as they had in ancient times. A modern world requires a different approach, and a world that had been touched by the gospel and had known the word of God was far different from the pre-Christian and pagan world that had not. So the gods would alter their appearances and hide their identities. It would begin in the shadows, on the fringes of American society and Western culture. It was there that the gods gained their first footholds, and from there they began their steady and progressive penetration of mainstream culture. But their ultimate object was not infiltration, but domination. The opening of the door. The gods could only return if there had been a falling away from the Christian faith and a biblical worldview. No single event or date can be pinpointed as the beginning of that falling away. It was a process. But there were milestones, turning points, and moments of critical mass. In the mid to late 20th century, America's departure from God became increasingly discernible. The nations of Western Europe were in the midst of a similar departure. The falling away would continue through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, unabated, deepening, widening, increasing in magnitude and momentum. This time period, the late 20th and early 21st century, represented the most widespread and massive falling away from the Christian faith and morality in the entire 2,000-year history of the Christian age. The falling away would go hand in hand with the return of the ancient spirits. America was the leading nation of the era and focal point of the post-World War II order. What would happen to American culture would touch the world. If the spirits could enter and gain possession of the American house, they could possess the age. The spiritual DNA. But if the gods were returning, then which gods? America is not made up of any one ethnicity or people group, but many, almost all. In many ways, America is a composite and summation of Western civilization. So then, what gods could relate not to one nation or ethnicity within Western civilization, but to all of them, or to Western civilization as a whole? The answer goes back to ancient Israel. The faith of Western civilization comes from ancient Israel. The Bible consists of the writings of Israel, the Psalms of Israel, the Chronicles and history of Israel, the prophecies of Israel, and the Gospel of Israel. The spiritual DNA of Western civilization comes from, and in many ways is, the spiritual DNA of ancient Israel. Seduced by other gods. In the case of America, the connection is even stronger. As Israel was consecrated to God from its inception, so was America. America was established after the pattern of ancient Israel. In its founding days, the Puritan leader John Winthrop gave the new civilization a charge based on Moses' charge to the Israelites. If America followed the ways of God, he said, it would become the most blessed, prosperous, and powerful of civilizations. But he also gave a prophetic warning. But if our hearts shall turn away, so that we will not obey, but shall be seduced and worship and serve other gods, our pleasure and profits, and serve them, we shall surely perish. So, America at its inception was given the same warning that Israel was given at its inception. It was warned against turning away from God and to the gods. It was warned against the seduction of the gods, just as the gods had seduced Israel. The gods of apostasy. And in this is the key that answers the question. The gods, or spirits that have returned to America and Western civilization, are the same gods and spirits that seduced ancient Israel in the days of its apostasy. In other words, if the nation founded after the pattern of ancient Israel, America, should apostatize from God, then it would become subject to the same gods and principalities that ancient Israel became subject to in its apostasy from God. The same principle applies on a larger scale to Western civilization. If a civilization indwelled by Israel's faith and word should apostatize from that faith, it would become subject to the same gods and spirits of Israel's apostasy. The Dark Trinity. So then, what were the gods of Israel's apostasy? There were several, but three of them were of special prominence. The three gods embodied the apostasy itself. One of the three remains something of a mystery. Another of the three was both one and many. And the other changed identities and appearances depending on the time, place, people, and culture. Together they constituted Israel's Dark Trinity. As for America, though there are many spirits and principalities, it is this same dark trinity that is most prominent in its fall from God, just as it was in Israel's fall from God. As they transformed ancient Israel, they are now transforming America and Western civilization, and through this, the world. The repaganization. Pagan spirits inhabit pagan vessels. Pagan gods indwell pagan cultures. What would happen then if the ancient pagan gods returned to a civilization based on a Judeo-Christian foundation, worldview, and moral framework? What would happen is that their return would trigger a metamorphosis. The Christian or biblically based culture would begin transforming into a pagan one. Christian values would be replaced by pagan values, Christian ethics by pagan ethics, and a Christian worldview by a pagan worldview. We would witness the paganization of American civilization and the repaganization of Western civilization. We now uncover the mask behind the... Three gods, the Dark Trinity, the Possessor. Part 4. The Possessor. Chapter 9. The Possessor. He was the king of gods, leader of spirits, and he would become the chief enemy of the God of Israel. Lord of the clouds. He was the god of fertility. His worshippers prayed to him to make fertile the soil and cause their crops to grow. They called him Lord of Rain, master of the waters that caused the earth to bear fruit. He was the god who rode on the clouds, the lord of storms. He was the one who hurled down bolts of lightning on the earth. If he prospered, the land prospered. If he languished, so did the people. He was a warrior. He would enter into battle with his fellow gods over and over again. In the end, though, he would reign supreme over his pantheon. It was the role he played with regard to the nation of Israel for which he is most known and notorious, and it was that role that concerns us with regard to the mystery. The Master. He was called Baal, or Baal, chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. His name can be translated as Lord, Owner, and Master. The Bible speaks of both Baal and the Baalim, or the Baals. He was one and, at the same time, many. Nations, regions, and cities each had their own Baals. There was Baal Hadad, Baal Hermon, Baal Tamar, Baal Peor, and Baal Zephon, among many others. Even families had their own personal Baal, clay figurine idols of the omnipresent deity. The alternate god. It was not long after the Israelites settled the Promised Land that they began turning away from God. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them, and they bowed down to them. Baal promised the Israelites fertility, fruitfulness, increased gain, and prosperity. Thus, as they began cultivating the land, the temptation to invoke his powers proved more and more compelling. Many Israelites turned away from God to follow him. He was so prominent that when the Bible mentions his name, along with those of other foreign gods, he is almost always mentioned first. To the people of Israel, he was the head of the other gods, and was himself the quintessential other god. In the 9th century BC, the worship of Baal had made such inroads into Israel's culture and state that those who refused to join it were persecuted, hunted down, and killed. It was over the worship of Baal that the prophet Elijah rose up against the apostate King Ahab and his co-regent Jezebel. Years later, after the nation's destruction, the scriptures would cite Israel's worship of Baal as central among the reasons for the calamity. No other deity was so connected to Israel's falling away from God and its subsequent destruction as was Baal. Baal and Zeus. In later days, Baal, in his incarnation as Baal Shemim, or Baal Shaman, was identified with the god Zeus, head of the Greek pantheon. An ancient Nabatean text says this: they regarded as God the Lord of Heaven, calling him Baal Samim, which is in the Phoenician language Lord of Heaven, and in Greek Zeus. Syriac writers referred to Baal Shemim as Zeus Olympius. Both gods appeared as idols, standing in the same position, with arms lifted up and ready to hurl a thunderbolt to the earth. Zeus was presented as Zeus Belus, and Jupiter as Jupiter Belus, which could be translated respectively as Zeus Baal and Jupiter Baal. And so when the gods were cast out of the Greco-Roman world, Baal Shemim, or Jupiter Belus, was one of the exiled deities. The anti-god. To the nation of Israel, Baal was the embodiment of paganism and of all pagan gods. He was the epitome of all that was not God and all that warred against him. Baal was the other god, the substitute god, the instead of God. He was Israel's anti-god. He was the God that Israel turned to when it turned away from God. He was the God who separated Israel from its God, who drew it away, who made it forget the God of its foundation. So if Baal was the God of the turning away, the God of the falling, the apostasy God, what would happen if he returned to the modern world? What would happen if he came back to possess a nation, a civilization? What would happen if Baal came to America? Chapter 10. The Possessor returns. How does a god of the ancient Middle East make his way into a 20th century Western nation? How would Baal come to America? Baal comes to America. What would be the sign of his coming? Baal was the god of apostasy. His mission was to take a nation that had known and been consecrated to God and turn it away from God, estranged and alienated from the God of its foundation. As Baal was the chief of the other gods in Israel's apostasy, he would be the first in America's apostasy and the one to lead the way for the others. The turning of a nation away from God and to the gods often begins with the smallest of steps and an almost imperceptible shifting. But any opening is enough for Baal to get in and then push the door further ajar. In the case of ancient Israel, it would seem a little thing to add prayers to Baal alongside the worship of God to increase one's prosperity. But it would not stay little. The once and other America. In the mid-20th century, the majority of Western nations were still viewed as Christian or Judeo-Christian, and America was decidedly and proudly so. It stood in clear opposition to Marxist ideology and the atheism of Soviet Russia and Communist China. America was a nation in which even liberal newspapers would publish summations of sermons preached throughout the city the previous Sunday. Its leading magazines could advocate for Christian morality and Christian revival. Its entertainment was expected to uphold biblical and Christian values and to never attack them. And it was not a strange thing for its television stations to sign off at night with a sermonette or prayer. It was a nation in which the majority of those on the political left and right saw themselves as sincere followers of Jesus or God, and in which politicians would freely cite God and Christian values in their public discourse. America in the mid-20th century was a nation in which children were not only allowed to pray in public schools, but actually led in prayer by their teachers, and where teachers read the Word of God in their classrooms. And it was an America that declared itself one nation under God. It was into that nation that the spirit of Baal came. The ancient amnesia. How does a spirit come into a nation that has known of God? The book of Judges reveals how it began in the case of ancient Israel. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs. In the book of Jeremiah, written in the last days of that apostasy, the voice of God laments over the nation's spiritual condition. Their fathers have forgotten my name for Baal. The mission of Baal is to cause a nation that has known God to stop knowing Him, and then to forget Him, and then to forget that it ever knew Him. The spirit of Baal caused Israel to forget the God of its foundation and become estranged from Him. By the end of the process, it could no longer remember or imagine what it was like to have known Him. The American amnesia. And so when Baal returned to the modern world, his mission would be the same, to cause America and the West to forget its God. How would he do that? After the destruction of Israel, or Samaria, in 722 BC, the Bible gave a requiem for the fallen kingdom. And they rejected his statutes testimonies which he had testified against them. They followed idols, became idolaters. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molded image and 2 calves, made a wooden image, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. The people were drawn away from the word of God, the laws of God, and the ways of God. In the case of America, Baal would use the same strategy. He would first seek to separate the nation from the word and ways of God. The banishing of God. Though the seeds of America's turning from God can be found in earlier days, it would become most noticeable and would achieve critical mass in the 1960s. It was at the beginning of that decade that America removed prayer from its public schools. The act was soon followed by the banning of God's word from the instruction of the nation's children. The Bible had always been part of the American public school system from its beginnings at Massachusetts Bay. Thus, the change was a monumental one, and with regard to the spirit of Baal, a strategic one. Children of Baal. When Baal was unable to possess one generation of Israelites, he would focus on the next, the nation's children. Since children represent the future, if he could take hold of America's children, he could take hold of America. So, by removing prayer and the word from the education of America's children, he was weakening the transmission of faith to the next generation. He could then separate the entire nation from prayer, from the word, and from faith. By causing God's ways to become alien to the nation's children, he could cause the alienation of America from God. The Baalization of America. Baal's American agenda was not limited to its school system. It would permeate every sphere of American culture. Its major newspapers would no longer publish summations of the past Sunday's sermons. Its leading magazines would no longer endorse Christian values. Its entertainment would no longer uphold biblical morality. Its politicians would speak less openly of Christian values, and its television stations would no longer promote prayer or present the ways of God in a positive light, but would now war against them. Praying to God or mentioning the name of Jesus in the public square would be increasingly viewed with hostility. The nation was becoming increasingly alienated from the ways of God. A war of tablets. The law that God gave Israel was a safeguard against the gods and the ways of paganism. The very first of the 10 Commandments was, "You shall have no other gods before me." So for Baal to gain possession of Israel, he had to separate the people from the law of God and, as it was summed up, the 10 Commandments. The writer of 2 Kings confirms what happened. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God. The 10 Commandments and the law were also at the foundation of Western civilization. In the case of America, they were specifically cited as the cornerstone on which the new society was to be built. So, for Baal to gain possession of America, he would do just as he did to ancient Israel. He would cause them to put away the 10 Commandments and depart from the ways of God. So in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that it was no longer legal to display the 10 Commandments in public schools. They were what the American school system had once taught and lifted up as the nation's moral foundation. Now it was illegal to even make them visible in public. But the conflict would not end in the halls of America's public schools. The nation would strike down the 10 Commandments more than once. The 10 Commandments would come under governmental judgment and be banished from the public square. The schizophrenic nation. Baal had turned Israel in upon itself. He caused the nation to war against its own foundation. His fingerprints could now be seen on an America at war with its own foundation. The fingerprints of the ancient god could be seen in the Supreme Court, which had ruled against a display of the Ten Commandments, and yet displayed the Ten Commandments on its very walls. They could be seen in the presidential inauguration as the president-elect placed his hand on the Bible to swear the presidential oath, and then, upon becoming president, enacted laws and policies that warred against the ways of the Bible upon which he swore. They could be seen in the nation's school system, which instructed the nation's children against the very ways for which that school system had come into existence. And they could be seen on the nation's currency, which was increasingly used to eradicate God's presence and ways from American public life, and upon which were written the words, "In God we trust." Baal had done to America as he had done to Israel. He turned it in against itself. It had become, as had ancient Israel, a civilization in spiritual schizophrenia. The end of Christian America. Since the word and law of God served as safeguards against the gods and paganism, their removal opened the door for the gods to come in unhindered. America had removed from public view the commandments against worshiping other gods. Now it could do so. It had removed the commandments forbidding sexual immorality. Now it could embrace it. It could now indulge in all that the commandments had warned against. Once the word of God was removed, there was nothing left to hold back the nation's fall. No absolute standard. The guardrails were down. There was now nothing to stop what would soon follow. The nation was left wide open to the subjection and dominion of the gods. The America where prayer and God's word were imparted to its children, where scripture was revered in its media and culture, and where the ways and precepts of God informed its laws and national policies, and were proclaimed in the public square, was no more. Observers would now write of the end of Christian America. Baal had succeeded. America was going to be altered beyond recognition. According to the parable, an empty house is a dangerous thing. America had emptied itself of God. It would not remain empty. Others would come in. Chapter 11. An exchange of gods. Could the ancient parable of spirits hold the key to what is now taking place in America and Western civilization? As the gospel entered into Western civilization, the gods departed. The spirits left the house. It was the advent of Christianity, the word and presence of God, the ascendancy of monotheism over paganism that caused their departure. But if these things should be weakened or removed, then the departed spirits and ancient gods would return. The door left open. And so it began. The hedge protecting American civilization was progressively weakened. The moral and ethical framework derived from the scriptures was overturned. So the two primary safeguards against the gods and that which in ancient times had cast them out, monotheism and the word, were now being nullified. The door that had closed to the gods would be reopened. In his mythologies, Baal entered into battle against other gods, and not only against the gods of Canaanite mythology, but against the God of Israel and his people, against all who kept his ways. His battle was waged in the realm of morality, spirituality, politics, and culture. So in late 20th century America, the return of Baal would bring about a cultural, civilizational, and spiritual collision. It would, at times, be described as a culture war, but it was much deeper than culture. The conflict was ultimately spiritual, that of Baal against God, the rematch of an ancient battle. In and out. came in via a spirit of openness and a call to embrace new ideas and ways. But his entrance would ultimately result in the progressive closing of the nation's openness to God. Every step the nation took to accept the new morality would be matched by an equal and opposite step toward the rejection of God and his ways. What was once seen as the source of virtue and freedom and joy was now viewed as a hindrance, a restraint, an oppression. As Baal had been cast out of the Jewish world and then, by the gospel, out of Western civilization, he would now seek to cast God out of America. What had been done to the gods in ancient times would now be done to God. America and the West would begin casting him out. It would happen subtly at first, but in time would deepen and widen and continue into the 21st century. God would be driven out of the halls of government, out of the public square, out of movie theaters, out of television sets, out of the arts, out of ethics, out of hearts, out of minds, and out of lives. Empty houses and returning spirits. But the ancient parable held an ominous warning for America and the West. The house, having been emptied, would not remain empty. Having cast out God, the gods would come in. The gods would come in to replace him. Having expelled the Spirit of God, other spirits would take possession. Baal would make America his home. He would be the spirit that, in the parable, then ushers the other spirits into the house. And so America's turning from God in the early 1960s would usher in other spirits and gods, and a future that no one at the time could have imagined. The law of the ancient parable would manifest in virtually every realm of American culture. When the nation removed prayer and the Bible from its schools, to some observers it seemed a small thing. But the removal left the house spiritually empty. And according to the parable, it would not remain empty. Other spirits would come to replace what was cast out. What would, in time, come into American classrooms would have been unimaginable to those alive at the time of the emptying. The nation's children would now be trained against the ways of God. The American school system had become a house of spirits. Baal goes to Hollywood and everywhere else. So too, American movie screens, having been emptied of God, would now be filled with that which was once forbidden and that which warred against the ways of God. It would happen to American television, American universities, American popular music, American youth and children's culture, American corporations, American houses of government, even some American houses of worship. Everything was darkening. The nation's institutions, having been emptied of God, were turning into houses of spirits. And it was not only the nation's institutions. America itself was now becoming a house of spirits. Could Baal actually manifest in America as he did in ancient Israel, in physical form? Chapter 12. The Molten Beast. Baal was the god of prosperity. As the lord of rains and fertility, he represented increase, gain, and profit. The belief that he could bring fruitfulness to one's fields and vineyards was among the strongest of his appeals and weapons in his battle against the God of Israel. American idols. The lure of Baal had always been a present danger in American culture. For any nation so blessed with material prosperity as was America, there would always be the risk that its prosperity would become an idol, and that it would turn to the god of increase and gain. But with America's departure from God in the late 20th century, the spirit of Baal became ascendant. Unlike the ancient apostasy, the spirit would not be centered on the fruit and yields of the years, God is called the Almighty. In a revealing choice of words, America dubbed its own currency the Almighty Dollar. The spirit of Baal could not be contained in the halls of business. It was everywhere. Americans pursued money, served money, were driven by money, and worshipped money as much as the ancients had worshipped their idols. American life became increasingly monetized. The spirit of Baal even went to church. As in ancient times, when Baal worship was added to the worship of God, so now the doctrines of Baal, the pursuit of material prosperity and personal gain and success above all things, invaded the sanctuary. And so what could have been a protection and antidote against the invasion was compromised. The bull god. Baal was typically portrayed as a bearded and helmeted figure, holding a spear of lightning in his upraised hand. Some of his images show the horns of a bull coming up from his head or helmet. Baal's preeminent symbol was the bull. The bull embodied his power and his connection to fertility. So his idols came in the form of the helmeted man, but also in the form of a bull of metal or clay. It was America's financial realm, and in particular, its stock market, and more in particular, Wall Street, that epitomized the unadulterated pursuit of money. It was there that the spirit of Baal, as it related to a nation's yield and prosperity, most clearly manifested. The prosperity of the stock market had long been tied to the prosperity of America as a whole. It was therefore striking that the symbol that had come to embody the prosperity of the stock market and America was the bull. Of course, the bull did not come to Wall Street because anyone was seeking a connection with Baal. Nevertheless, it did come. And the fact that the symbol of American prosperity was the same ancient symbol of national prosperity, and that it was so without any conscious intent, is even more striking. If the American stock market appeared heading toward increase, gain, and prosperity, it was the market of the bull market. So Baal's ancient symbol became not only an American symbol, but one that embodied the same realm and dynamic as it had in ancient times. The Egel and the apostasy. But the appearance of the bull in ancient Israel was a symbol as well of something else. A nation's apostasy from God. More specifically, the bull was the symbol of a nation that had once known God, that had once been consecrated to his ways, but now had forgotten him. It was the sign of a nation that had rejected him to follow other gods. So it was in ancient Israel, and so it would be again in America. The younger version of the bull was also critical in Israel's history. The Hebrew word egel refers specifically to a young bull, a male calf, also known as a bull calf. In Israel's apostasy from God at Mount Sinai, the people created a golden egel, a bull calf. So the calf, or young bull, became the symbol of national apostasy, the sign of a nation's departure. Centuries later, Jeroboam, leader of the rebellion that split the kingdom of Israel in two, erected two golden calves, one at each end of his kingdom. He then called his people to worship them as their gods. The bull calf, again became the sign of a nation's fall from God. The apostasy at Sinai and of Jeroboam involved an image of molten metal. So too, the worship of Baal involved the making of molten bulls for the purpose of worship. So Israel, in its fall from God, worshipped bulls and calves of molten metal. After the destruction of Jeroboam's kingdom, the writers of 2 Kings would write, "So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molten image, and served Baal." Thus, the sign of a nation that has left his commandments, his word and ways, is the appearance of the molten image materialism and gain, it would be a sign of a nation that had once known God, but had turned away and was now worshiping another god, Baal. Materialization. The sign appeared. The site of its materialization was the financial district of New York City, just outside the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street. It appeared in December of 1989. It was massive, 11 feet tall and 16 feet long. It weighed 7,100 pounds. It was a molten image in the form of a giant beast, a bull, the sign of Baal. It would later be moved to a location where it could stand as a permanent landmark of New York City, but it would remain in the city's financial district not far from the stock exchange and the most massive and concrete symbol ever to represent Wall Street. Thus, the sign of Baal, the god of increase and gain, would be linked to the New York Stock Exchange, America's house of increase and gain. The image was described as a symbol of aggressive financial optimism and prosperity. The words themselves were a modern recasting of the power of the ancient god. Though meant to encourage the nation, the sign was menacing. The bull's nostrils were flaring as if ready to attack. One observer described the molten creature as an angry, dangerous beast. Another described it as embodying an aggressive or even belligerent force. The other image. On the day it appeared on Wall Street, the bull was not alone. There was another image overlooking it. It was the statue of the nation's first president, George Washington. The bull appeared on the ground on which America came into existence as a constituted nation. It was there that Washington was sworn in as the nation's first president. After being sworn in, Washington delivered a prophetic warning. He said, in effect, if America ever turned away from God and his eternal laws, its blessings would be removed. It was an echo of Winthrop's earlier warning against ever turning to other gods, our pleasure and profits. And now, standing across from the statue that commemorated the day and place in which Washington gave that prophetic warning against turning away from God, was the sign that the nation had done exactly that. It had turned away from God. The American Baal. So the sign of Baal that had once appeared in the high places and sacred pagan grounds of the Middle East now appeared in America. As in ancient times, it appeared in molten metal. In fact, the ancient bulls of Baal were often of molten bronze. So the bull that appeared in New York City was also of molten bronze. It was the American incarnation of Baal. It was, as well, the American version of the golden calf, the ancient biblical sign of a nation that had once known God and had fallen away, and that another god had mastered it. In ancient Israel, the molten bull constituted a tangible image and sign of the possessing god. But his impact and effect upon the nation was much deeper. What about the return of Baal to the modern world? What was his deeper impact on America and the West? It is that to which we now go as we uncover the paganization of America and modern civilization. Chapter 13. The Deep Magic. If a nation changes its god, the nation itself will be changed. So as America turned from God to the spirit of Baal, a transformation took place. The ancient god began working his deep magic and set in motion the paganization of American and Western civilization. It would happen on a multitude of levels, some brazen or overt, others not as obvious, but deeper under the surface and, in the end, even more profound and far-reaching. These were the deeper consequences of America's paganization. Gods, isms, and turns away from deity, then all things become subject to deification. Or, in other words, if nothing is God, then anything and everything is God. So it was not only that Israel turned to Baal, it also turned to the Baalim, or the many Baals. Most Americans would never admit to turning to such things or creating idols, nor would they utter the names of the gods. Nevertheless, as did Israel in its fall, America now turned to worship its own American gods and fashioned its own American idol. Deification. As America turned from God, it began deifying the objects of its culture. The worship, the passion, and the energy that had once infused its devotion to God were now redirected to that which was not God. And that which was not God now became sanctified, empowered, and enchanted. Substitutes for God had always existed, but now, with the expelling of God, they began taking on the garb of deity. In the absence of God, there was nothing that could not be deified. One's God is that which is one's ultimate reality. Therefore, it cannot be questioned. So there now arose new movements, causes, ideologies, and systems of thought that could not be challenged or questioned, no matter how irrational they were, since they were now gods. Rather, one had to bow down before them, whether the gods were of political correctness, or wokeness, or a multitude of others. As faith was removed from God, it was given to other things. New ideologies came in to fill the void and rule as gods, as their movements took on the characteristics of religions. The worship of Baal was one of carnality and vulgarity. So as America turned from God to Baal, its culture underwent a process of vulgarization. Its national discourse turned increasingly crude, its entertainment increasingly carnal, and its overall culture increasingly profane. The fabrication of truth. The spirit of Baal works toward the altering of perception. Where there is one God, there is an ultimate and objective reality, a unifying reference point and standard by which all can be discerned, measured, and judged. Where there is God, there is truth. But where there is more than one God, or many gods and Baals, the door is open for many truths, conflicting truths, and thus no truth. When one makes an idol, one is fabricating one's own God, and thus one's own ultimate reality, and one's own truth. But when one creates truth, truth becomes a fabrication, and ceases to be truth. And when one creates or holds to one's own truth, truth again ceases to be. 2 + 2 cannot equal 4 for one person, and 5 for another. So one of the signs of Baal's subversion of a culture is that the culture will turn away from objectivity to subjectivity. And so as America and Western civilization turned away from God, they began undergoing a process of subjectification. As they moved away from the truth, they moved away from the concept of truth itself, that there was any truth to begin with. The transformation affected language. Truth was now what was true for the individual. If a man believed he was not himself, but was someone or something other than what he was, a child, a woman, a leopard, or a tree, there was no ultimate or absolute truth, or any truth, no objective reality to contradict his own personal truth. And if one's personal truth contradicted reality, then it was reality that would have to be bent into conformity. The overturner. And so, without God, there was no more truth, and, in fact, no more reality. Words were now redefined. What was right was now wrong, and what was wrong was now right. Values were altered, people were altered. And reality was forced to bend its knee before the new idols, or else become the clay to be molded into the image of the new gods. So, by the spirit of Baal, the eternal truths were overturned. Values and standards that had stood for thousands of years were now discarded with a single vote of a legislature or a president's executive order. And the foundation stones of Judeo-Christian civilization could now be struck down by a single ruling of the nation's judiciary. Of course, any position that denies truth and the existence of absolutes must ultimately contradict itself. It will, in the end, assert its own absolute truth. But even this was a sign of Baal's spirit. It was the other side. If one can turn the absolute truth into what is subjective, then one can turn the subjective into absolute truth. The very act of creating an idol or a god is to forge out of nothing a new absolute. And so in the absence of God, American culture forged new truths, created new laws and commandments, and molded new absolutes out of the molten metal of its apostasy. And as it was in ancient Israel when Baal came into power, those who would not bow down before the new gods and idols would be punished, cancelled. The gods repackaged. But it was not only polytheism, the belief in multiple gods, that characterized paganism, but pantheism, the belief that all was God. And so the return of Baal would also bring about the return of pantheism. It could be seen in the secular or materialistic belief that there was nothing other than or more than the world or the universe. Thus, the physical world was the ultimate reality. The world was God, and God was the world. And it was no accident that as America began driving God out of its life, it began opening itself up to other spiritualities. Several of these fell under the umbrella of New Age teachings, movements, sects, and practices. But behind the new veneer and modern packaging was ancient paganism. Some of the streams of New Age movements and teachings had a distinctly polytheistic bent. Some involved the conjuring of spirits. Others involved the invoking of ancient gods and goddesses. But other streams were distinctly pantheistic. God was all, and all was God. Beyond the return to paganism, the embrace of New Age beliefs often represented a turning to Eastern beliefs and a further departing from the Christian and biblical faith. But it was the more imperceptible penetration of pantheism into American and Western culture and consciousness that would prove to be more profound and pivotal. Even those who saw themselves as Christian were often unwittingly affected as their thinking and perceptions were subtly altered. Worshipping Gaia. Baal led Israel into the worship of nature. So it is no accident that it was at this same time of apostasy and the spirit of Baal that American and Western civilization began to embrace the worship of nature. Nature was no longer a gift from God to be stewarded. It was now the ultimate reality. The earth would be christened with the name of the ancient goddess Gaia, and the world would be deified. Man was of nature. Nature was God. Man was God. And God was everything. Pantheism. Distinctions were eradicated, and lines were crossed. One of these lines was that between man and animal. This too went back to Baal. The rise of the animal men. As we have seen, Baal was depicted in both human and animal forms. It was typical of paganism, in its mythology and imagery, to merge form, to mix humans with animals, one species with another. While the Hebrew scriptures emphasized uniqueness and distinctions, the pagan world nullified them. So as the spirit of Baal came upon America and the modern world, lines that had never been crossed were now breached, and distinctions that had artisans had merged man and animal in images of stone and clay, modern scientists now merged them, but not through molding clay or chiseling stone, but by molding and splicing the genetic code. The distinction between man and animal was increasingly blurred. The offspring of animals could now be given rights and protections that millions of human babies were never afforded. And man was increasingly viewed as something of a glorified animal. It was one of the unvarying effects of Baal and the gods. They degraded all who worshipped them and debased all who served them. The drowning lifeguard. The bending, blurring, and breaking of distinctions characteristic of the pagan world began seeping into nearly every corner of American culture and life. The distinctions between right and wrong, life and death, the natural and the unnatural, man and woman, good and evil. They were now blurring, bending, and breaking. It was all born of the same root, the pagan confusion and merging of the creator and the creation, God and man. If the world was God and man was one with the world, then man was God. As God, he could nullify reality or create another. He could even recreate himself. He could make the unnatural natural and the natural unnatural. He could alter values, turn right into wrong, evil into good, and good into evil. But if man had become God, and God was the world, then there was nothing else. Then there was nothing beyond the world to give meaning to life or purpose to existence. And if the world was broken and the world was God, then God was also broken. And then there could be no repair. And if man was lost and man was God, then God was lost, and there was no hope of redemption. And so the dismal emptiness and hopeless despair of ancient paganism began creeping back into Western civilization and darkening it. For how could there be any hope of redemption or salvation if the one drowning was the lifeguard? Under the deep magic of Baal, America was morphing into something altogether alien to what it had once been and once stood for. As he had done to ancient Israel, he was now doing to America. The leader of Christian civilization was becoming distinctly pagan. Baal had turned America into its own antithesis. Could an ancient word lie behind our most advanced technologies, and an ancient mystery lie behind the rise of the computer? Chapter 14. The Masters. When the people of Israel turned from God, they turned not only to the gods, but to a specific kind of God. They sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to carved images. They turned to the Balaam. Who or what exactly were the Balaam? In order to answer that, we must first define what exactly the gods and idols were to the people of the ancient world, and what they are to us now. The identity of a god. With regard to the worshipper, a god or idol is that which one ultimately worships, serves, and lives for. It is that which one most focuses and dwells on, and from which one takes the greatest joy. It is that which one most reveres and is led, moved, and driven by. It is one's ultimate reality and the purpose of one's life. So, if one turns from God, there will always be another, a god or an idol. The Balaam. The Hebrew word Balaam literally means the Baals. The Balaam was Baal in his plural form. He had appeared in a multitude of forms and variations, and was embodied by a multitude of idols. So Baal was manifested through the Baals. The word Balaam can also be translated as the lords, the owners, and the masters. If one turns away from God, one will end fulfillment. But instead, it led to enslavement, to the bondage of the Balaam. And as in ancient times, the Balaam appeared in a multitude of forms. So Americans now served and were mastered by the Baals of money, pleasure, success, acceptance, sexual gratification, addictions, work, comfort, the internet, self-fulfillment, self-obsession, and countless other gods and idols, the Baals of the modern world. Instead of freedom, Americans saw their culture becoming increasingly driven, restless, conflicted, obsessed, and addicted. And the further the nation moved from God, the more powerful the Balaam became. To America, devoid of God, the pursuit of money and success became an unbridled spirit that possessed millions. With Americans devoid of God, offered up sacrifices to the Balaam. So did the Americans. For the Balaam of money and success, they sacrificed much of their lives. For the Balaam of pleasure, they sacrificed their well-being, their health, their marriages, their families, and their children. The new modern Balaam were more than ruthless masters. They were deadly. Of Israel's fall to idols, the prophet Isaiah wrote, "Their land is also full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands." That was the irony of idolatry. They worshipped as gods the very thing that they themselves had created, the work of their own hands. They had created their own Baals. The Mars Hill mystery. When the Apostle Paul came to Athens, a city filled with gods, altars, and idols, his spirit was, as recorded in the book of Acts, provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. When he later stood on Mars Hill before the city's leaders, he addressed the worship of idols. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. He was using the same argument presented by the prophets. They were worshipping that which they themselves had devised, what their own hands had made. In speaking of the creation of idols, the apostle used the Greek word techne. From that same word linked to the idols of man, we get the modern word technology. In other words, technology comes from a word used in Scripture in connection with idols. The high-tech idol. America was largely responsible for ushering in the age of high technology and for creating the modern computer. The computer represented the most sophisticated and advanced work of man's hands, the most advanced form of man's techne. And in the age of apostasy, it has become among the most powerful of man's idols and the most complex of the Balaam. Under the spirit of Baal, the Israelites worshipped and served the works of their hands. Under the spirit of Baal, America did likewise. The ancient idols were deaf, blind, and mute, unable to move or act. But the high-tech idols of the modern world were more powerful. They could see, hear, and speak, and do almost anything. And each generation became more attached to them, more plugged in, and more addicted to them than the generation before. And each found it harder to break free of their spell. The breach of reality. In the pagan world, it was not only the god who was worshipped, but the idol, the image of the god. The idol and the god were one. America and modern culture, the line between image and reality was likewise breached. Image became reality, and reality became image. More and more people were living more and more of their lives in a virtual world, a world of fabricated virtual reality. The virtual became increasingly real, and the real became increasingly virtual, just as truth became increasingly virtual. American and modern culture was now saturated with a flood of images and sounds that signified nothing, a hymn to the idol. They will become like them. The book of Psalms reveals a profound truth concerning the dynamic between the worshiper and the idol. Their idols have mouths, but they do not speak. Eyes they have, but they do not see. Those who make them are like them. In other words, the one who makes, serves, or worships an idol will end up being transformed into its image. So the new technological idols, the digital Baals, would begin altering the nature of man. Computers began taking on human functions, abilities, and similitudes. Artificial intelligence was increasingly rivaling human intelligence and taking over its functions. At the same time, man, increasingly joined to his computer, began taking on the qualities of his digital master. The more one was joined to a computer, the more one began functioning as its appendage. So computers became more human, and those joined to them became less and less so. As the ancient warning of Scripture had foretold, those who made them had now become like them. The machine man. The line between man and machine was blurring. There was more and more talk and experimentation involving merging man and technology, whether through digital implants or other technological enhancements of human abilities. The line became even more blurred as people began having sexual and romantic relationships with robots. But even this was part of the ancient mystery of paganism and the gods. In paganism, man creates gods and worships the works of his hands. The creator worships his creation. The line between creator and creation is blurred and breached. So if technology is the creation of man, then the pagan blurring and merging of God and man will be manifested in the blurring and merging of man and his technology, creator and creation, man and machine, a hybrid of both. American and Western civilization had now created the most powerful of idols, and the present generation, more than any other, now served its own creation, its new master, the technique of its own hands. It was the day of the new masters, the age of the technological Baal. An object appeared in the streets of New York City. It was shrouded in mystery, covered in a sheet. Most of the city's inhabitants had no idea what it was. The city would unveil it. The object was linked to an ancient god and to the Dark Trinity. Chapter 15. The Arch. Beyond the molten bowl, another sign of Baal appeared in America, and again in New York City. And on the day of its appearing, the city would hold a celebration in its honor. Baal's role in Israel's fall was critical. The nation would be destroyed, but Baal would go on. He was worshipped throughout the Middle East up to the first centuries of the present age. In the first century, in the city of Palmyra, in what is now Syria, a temple was built for his worship. A century later, a second temple of Baal was built in the same city, nearby the first. The Temple of Baal. The first would be known as the Temple of Baal, or the Temple of Bel, after the god's Babylonian name. The II would be known as the Temple of Baal Shemim, referring to the god as the Lord of the Heavens, or the Baal of the Sky. Both temples would remain standing for nearly 2,000 years. Less than 100 years after the building of the Temple of Baal Shemim, a monumental arch was added, the Arch of Palmyra. It was built to connect the Temple of Bel with the city's main colonnaded avenue. The arch was the gateway through which the inhabitants of Palmyra would enter in order to worship their supreme deity. It stood in between the two temples. In the spring of 2015, the jihadist organization ISIS invaded Palmyra. After gaining control of the city, its soldiers began the systematic destruction of the city's ancient buildings and artifacts. After surviving nearly 2,000 years of history, the two temples of Baal were destroyed, as was the arch between them. The mystery object. In September of the following year, a mysterious object appeared in New York City. Mysterious as it was shrouded in white cloth, so no one could actually see it. It was massive, nearly 11 tons of Egyptian marble and rising nearly 20 feet from the ground. It was an arch, a massive recreation of the arch that led to the Temple of Baal. It had appeared in London and would later appear in other Western cities, including Washington, D.C., but the appearance of the arch that had served as the entranceway to Baal's temple in New York City was especially significant, for New York City had played a central role in America's apostasy from God and, in many ways, served as the capital of that fall. It had functioned as a conduit for Baal's entrance into American civilization. City of Baal. And it was New York City in which stood America's modern equivalents to the temples of Baal, its houses and monuments of materialism, increase, and gain. It could even be said that New York City was itself a spiritual temple of Baal. Even the location of the arch within the city was significant. It was erected in Lower Manhattan at the entrance to the city's financial district. Nearby was Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange, and the other side of Baal, the molten bull of Wall Street. As the Arch of Palmyra once stood as the entranceway to the Temple of Baal, the arch in New York City now stood at the entranceway to America's temples of Baal. And as the ancient arch had connected Baal's temple with the city's main avenue, the recreated arch stood by New York City's most famous and main avenue, Broadway, the modern equivalent to the Great Colonnade at Palmyra. So too did the molten bull. The two symbols of Baal were joined. The specific site chosen for the arch was also significant. It was erected on the grounds of City Hall, New York City's central seat of government, and the city officials would take part in its unveiling. The unveiling. On the morning of September 19th, 2016, New Yorkers gathered around the arch for a special event, its unveiling and presentation. By the arch stood a sign, placed there by the event's sponsors, on which the name of Baal appeared. Among the speakers at the unveiling was the city's deputy mayor, who described the erection of the arch as an act of defiance. Providing the ambiance for the event was a band playing Middle Eastern music, evocative of the sounds that would have accompanied the music played in ancient times in the Temple of Baal. It was to those Middle Eastern sounds that the massive sheet covering the object was pulled away and the arch revealed to the applause of the gathered spectators. Baal on Capitol Hill. One can find incidents of Baal worship in the earliest days of Israel's history, as early as its entrance into the Promised Land. The incidents served as a warning of the greater apostasy that would come in later times. So too, America's relationship with Baal, and even with his temples in Palmyra, began long before the Arch of Palmyra appeared on its shores. In 1753, after After an expedition to the Middle East, to Palmyra, the British scholar Robert Wood published The Ruins of Palmyra. The book would influence English and American architects of the era. It is believed that through that book, the elements of the ancient Temple of Baal in Palmyra were incorporated into the U.S. Capitol building. It is also believed that from one of the drawings in that book, that of an eagle from one of the temples of Palmyra, came the Great Seal of the United States. As with Israel, so with America, the potential for national apostasy was there from the beginning, a shadow of Baal embedded in the nation's spiritual DNA. America had been conceived after the pattern of ancient Israel, and so if it turned away from God in that day, the spirit of Baal would enter in, and now it had. Baal's portal. And so the nation that had turned to Baal received the sign of Baal in the form of a massive stone arch. The entranceway to Baal's temple was placed at the entranceway to American civilization. And that the arch would appear in other Western capitals was also a sign. The civilization that had once identified itself with the faith of ancient Israel was now being marked with the sign of Baal, the god by which Israel had fallen away from its faith. The sign of a civilization now waging war against the ways of God. The arch was the gateway to and from the worship of Baal. Its reappearance was the sign of a nation and a civilization that had given him a portal and welcomed him back. A sign that that nation and that civilization had now become a temple of Baal. Could an ancient event that took place by a desert mountain contain a prophetic revelation and a critical warning concerning what is now taking place in America and Western civilization? And could that revelation and warning be embedded in the walls of the American government? Chapter 16. The Golden Calf Civilization. Before we move to the second god of the Dark Trinity, we must return to an ancient mountain for one more revelation. The prototype. The first case of national apostasy recorded in Scripture was that of Israel's fall at Mount Sinai. While Moses stood on the mountaintop receiving the 10 Commandments, the people of Israel waited at the mountain's base. Growing impatient at his delayed return, they decided to make a god of molten metal in the image of an egel, the bull calf. After creating the idol, they held a celebration in its honor. They feasted and drank with music and festivity, offered up sacrifices on its altar, and as the scriptures record, corrupted themselves. Then came judgment. What happened at Sinai was a prototype and template of national apostasy. The template is now replaying in America and Western civilization. The central elements of that prototype have reappeared. The departure from the word and ways of God, the rejection of the 10 Commandments, the process of deification, the worshiping and serving of idols, and the replacement of God with a flood of sensuality and licentiousness. And in the case of America, we may add in the actual creation of a molten image of the bull family and the actual striking down of the 10 Commandments. The face of Moses. There is another element from the apostasy at Sinai. The face of Moses, gazing down in anguish at his nation's fall. There is, on Capitol Hill, in the chamber where the House of Representatives convenes, a face. It is a unique face, the only full-faced representation in that chamber. In fact, all the other faces in profile are turned to it. It is the face of Moses. It gazes down at the speaker's podium. It looks down at the chamber's proceedings, voting, and passing of legislation, and at the State of the Union address on the president. The face of Moses also appears on the walls of the nation's highest court. The most prominent figure on the Supreme Court's eastern side is that of Moses, holding the 2 tablets, just as he did on the mountaintop on the day of the golden calf. The tablets appear as well on the doors that lead into the Supreme Court chambers. So as Moses looked down on Israel's apostasy from Mount Sinai, he now looked down from Capitol Hill and the nation's highest court. He looked down on the House of Representatives when it sought to enact laws that warred against the laws of God. He looked down on the president when he sought to advance an agenda to overturn the ways of God. Days of the golden calf. He looked down from the Supreme Court with the 10 Commandments in hand as the Supreme Court struck down the 10 Commandments in the public square. He looked down on the podium in the House chamber when the officiant dedicated the new Congress to the pagan god Rama. He looked down on America as it descended into apostasy, as he had looked down on Israel as it descended into apostasy on the day of the golden calf. The nation that had been founded after the pattern of ancient Israel had now fallen after the pattern of Israel's fall. It had turned from God and given itself to the gods. Darkness had become light. Light had become darkness. Sin was now holy, and holiness was sin. Everything was inverted. And Baal, the god of inversion, had done it. He had worked his dark magic. And the words of the prophets concerning ancient Israel now spoke to America and Western civilization. They had forgotten his name for Baal. That which had been consecrated to God at its inception was now possessed by his enemy. For it could not be forgotten that the name Baal also meant the possessor. Baal was the first. He opened the door, but he was not alone. He had a wife, or mistress. We now move to the next of the returning spirits, the second god of the Dark Trinity, and the mystery of the Enchantress. Part 5. The Enchantress. Chapter 17. The Enchantress. The second god of the Dark Trinity was a she. She was among the most potent of gods and among the oldest, having first appeared in ancient Sumer. The goddess. She was so important among the gods of the ancient Middle East that she was given the title Queen of Heaven. She was joined to the celestial lights, to the moon, which some of her mythologies name as her father, and to the sun, which was often named as her brother. But it was another celestial light with which she was most associated, Venus. She was the goddess of sexuality. It was because of that connection that the planet Venus is associated with love. She was also the goddess of war and destruction. She was fiery, impetuous, impulsive, greedy, emotional, demanding, stormy, fierce, carnal, given to rage, romantic, vindictive, full of unbridled passion, insatiable sexual desire, and boundless pride. If denied the object of her desires, or if offended, she would become vengeful and violent and could wreak havoc and destruction. The transgressor. She was the breaker of rules, the trespasser of boundaries, and the transgressor of standards and conventions. She would demand that which belonged to others. In one myth, when the gods were unaware, she stole their sacred possessions. In another, she demanded entrance into the land of the dead, the underworld, and pounded on its gates, threatening to break them down if her will was refused. In another, she demanded that the gods give to her the bull of heaven to bring revenge on her enemies, and threatened that if her demand was denied, she would release the dead into the world of the living. She was the goddess of prostitution, The prostitutes of ancient Mesopotamia looked to her as their patron and protector, and it was not beyond the goddess to take on the appearance, nature, and function of the prostitute herself. Seductress. She was a seducer, a temptress, a goddess who captivated, allured, and snatched away. As the patron goddess of the tavern or alehouse, she was associated with the partaking of alcohol, particularly of beer. She dwelled in the taverns and there mixed sexuality with intoxication. In Sumerian mythology, her foremost lover was named Dumuzi. In Assyria and Babylon, he was known as Tammuz. It was her anger toward him that brought about his death. She then wept inconsolably over her loss, but she was never a faithful wife or lover. Tammuz was one of many. In the famous Mesopotamian poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the goddess even sought to seduce the story's hero, who responded by spurning her advances. She was the goddess of sexual promiscuity. Enchantress. Her images were everywhere, in clay idols and stone reliefs. She often appeared as naked or as a woman revealing herself. She often appeared next to her symbols, the moon or crescent, the sun, and her star, which was associated with the planet Venus. And she was often depicted in her function as goddess of war, brandishing weapons and entering into combat. It was undoubtedly because of this role that she was associated with the lion. It would often appear in her depictions as symbols of her ferocity and power. She was also an enchantress, a sorceress, a goddess of magic and spells. She specialized in love magic, the enchantment that conjured desire, or that altered one's affections and behavior. She seized and possessed her worshippers. She moved and spoke through her priestesses, who served as her vessels. Priests and prostitutes. Her cult reflected her nature. Her worship was saturated with carnality, sensuality, and open sexuality. Ancient writings speak of her temples as akin to houses of prostitution. It is believed that every year on the 10th day of the Mesopotamian New Year's festival of Akitu, the Babylonian kings would perform ritual sex acts in her temple. Whether these acts involved the consummation of sexual union, or rather a symbolic form of union, is still debated. This would take place through the goddess's high priestess, who would act as her surrogate. Her ritualized temple sex was not confined to kings and high priestesses. According to the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, the women of Babylonia were compelled by religious custom to sit in the temples of the goddess and perform the function of prostitutes, having relations with a stranger in exchange for money. According to Herodotus, every woman of the land was compelled to perform the act at least once in her life. From such practices come the concepts of sacred sex, temple prostitution, cult prostitution, and the sacred prostitute. All these were especially connected to Ishtar. Such things might be expected of a deity who was so linked to prostitutes or a prostitute herself. And yet it went still further. Even writers of ancient times, those familiar with the practices of her cult, described them as disgraceful and infamous. Her proclivity to flout conventions and break rules would make her the goddess of those on the fringes of society. Ishtar. She was among the most ubiquitous and protean of deities. She was able to modify her appearance or trappings to adapt to new peoples, cultures, and lands. In the Bible, she is called Ashtoreth. She is also spoken of in the plural form of her name, Ashtaroth. As with Baal, she was everywhere. She manifested in differing forms in different cities, regions, and lands, and her idols could be found throughout the Middle Eastern world. In Canaanite mythology, she was connected to Baal and appears often as his wife or consort. Her influence was so great and so pervasive that one can see facets of her nature, her roles, her functions and attributes in a myriad of goddesses from the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and beyond. In the Canaanite and West Semitic world, she was called Astarte. The Sumerians called her Inanna. In Assyria, Babylon, and much of the Mesopotamian world, she was known as Ishtar. To the Greeks, she became Aphrodite. At the same time, her young lover, Dumuzi, or Tammuz, became the god Adonis. And to the Romans, she became the goddess Venus. Thus, the planet behind the star of Ishtar would be named after the goddess's Roman name. Ishtar in exile. We will refer to her as a single goddess and spirit. Though her other names will at times appear in this book, the goddess will most often be called by the most famous of her Mesopotamian names, Ishtar. When the Christian faith entered the Roman and Middle Eastern world, the goddess, along with the other deities and spirits, was cast out. In an age that saw the covenant of marriage as sacred and sexuality as a gift exclusively given and belonging to that covenant, a principality and cult devoted to carnal desire and unbridled sexuality could not be maintained. The goddess went into exile. But what if she was to come back? What if Ishtar was to return to the modern world, and specifically to America? What would happen? Could she set in motion a transformation just as massive and critical as that set in motion by Baal? Or even more so? Chapter 18. The Enchantress Returns. How did the second principality enter into America and the West? To find the answer, we must look back at how she gained entrance into ancient Israel. Mrs. Baal. It was early on, soon after the Israelites settled in the land, that they began turning to other gods. The first record of its turning is found in the book of Judges. The passage speaks first of the Israelites' embrace of the Baalim, or Baals. Then it says this: "They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths." From the very beginning, the two gods, Baal and Ashtoreth, or Ishtar, were linked together. The connection reappears later on in the book of Judges. Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. It appears as well in the book of 1 Samuel, when the people realized the consequences of their apostasy. Then they cried out to the Lord and said, "We have sinned, because we have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and Ashtoreths." The Baal-Ashtoreth connection. Why are the two joined together? The fact that they could be portrayed in their mythologies as married or as lovers would account for some of it. But the connection between the two gods is deeper, and one that transcends mythology. So too is the order in which their names appear. It is Baal who is first, and then Ashtoreth. Israel first turned to Baal, and then to Ashtoreth. Baal leads to Ashtoreth. Baal represented the nations turning away from God and to the physical, the material, the carnal, and the sensual. It was this that opened the door for the entrance of Ashtoreth, or Ishtar, and with it, unbridled sexuality, licentiousness, and decadence. The worship of Baal had elements of all these things, but Ashtoreth was their incarnation. The one god ushered in the other, and the one spirit the next. The god of the apostasy ushered in the goddess of sexual licentiousness and debauchery. Ishtar comes to America. What would this mean for America and the West? If America's turning from God began to manifest in the early 1960s, and with it, the entrance of Baal, we would then expect this to be followed by the entrance of Ashtoreth or Ishtar. And what would then happen in the wake of that entrance? We would expect a transformation to begin that would alter the realm of sexuality. With the goddess's entrance, we would expect biblical standards and ethics surrounding sexuality and marriage to begin to erode. We would expect the moral foundations and values that had undergirded Western civilization for nearly 2,000 years to begin overturning. In short, we would expect there to be a revolution in the realm of sexuality, a sexual revolution. Ishtar and the sexual revolution. And that is exactly what took place. Shortly after America's turning from God began manifesting in the early 1960s, another transformation took place in the realm of sexuality. It would be one of the central defining movements of the 1960s, and it would continue long after the decade was over. It would not stop until it had transformed American and Western culture beyond recognition. The effect of the America could be summed up in 3 words: the sexual revolution. There had been another sexual revolution. It took place in ancient times in the Greco-Roman world. It was the revolution by which biblical sexual ethics, ideals, and morality replaced those of the pagan world. It happened at the same time the gods were cast out of Western civilization. The 2 phenomena were connected. The casting out of the gods included the casting out of the Roman Venus, the Greek Aphrodite, the Phoenician Astarte, and the Mesopotamian Ishtar, all the varied manifestations of the goddess of sexuality. It was in the goddess's departure that biblical values replaced pagan ones, and the first sexual revolution took place. But if the goddess should return, it would mean that pagan sexual values would now overturn biblical ones. In other words, the sexual revolution that took place in America and Western civilization in the late 20th century was the reversing of the sexual revolution that took place in ancient times. It was the advent of the gospel that broke the goddess's spell. But now, upon her return, the spell would be cast again on America, the West, and the world. The spell of the sorceress. The sexual revolution was another dimension of the paganization of America and Western civilization. The values it represented were pagan values, and the sexuality was pagan sexuality. What was branded as the new morality was in actuality an old morality, an ancient morality, the morality of the gods. The reappearance of that morality was a sign that the departed spirits had returned to the house. The aim of the goddess was to destroy the morality and faith by which she was expelled. To do that, she would have to take a Christian nation and a civilization that, with regard to sexuality and marriage, upheld biblical morality and practices, and lead it into embracing pagan morality and practices. To do that, as with the return of Baal, she would have to work incrementally, step by step, and progressively. But it was the spirit of Ishtar, and to Ishtar especially belonged the powers of seduction and spells. So in recasting her ancient spell, she would begin the seduction of America and the modern world. What would it mean if America were to come under the spell of an ancient goddess? Chapter 19. The Great Seduction. What exactly would happen if the spirit of the goddess took possession of a culture? What would happen if it took possession of America? And then came Ishtar. In the American and Western culture of the mid-20th century, sexuality was seen as the sacred domain of marriage, and marriage as the sacred and lifelong covenant of love between a husband and wife. These values were largely the same as they had been in ancient times at the advent of Christianity. Sex outside of marriage, whether premarital or extramarital, was seen as sin. Divorce was frowned upon. If a woman became pregnant before marriage, she and the child's father were expected to marry. The divorce rate was minuscule. So was the percentage of people living together outside of marriage, as was the rate of children born out of wedlock. Prostitution existed, but was illegal and confined to the underworld. Pornography was taboo, and for the most part, kept out of mainstream culture and public view. Even those who broke such standards would, for the most part, keep their behavior private. American entertainment and popular culture were expected to uphold the same values. Beyond illusion and suggestion, sexual relations were generally not depicted on the movie screen. Hollywood was expected to follow an agreed-upon code of morality as to what could and could not be shown, and it did. Nudity of any kind was forbidden. Any allusion to sex outside of marriage was not to be portrayed in a positive light, and for television screens, the parameters were even tighter. And then came Ishtar. deification of sex. We have seen the dynamic of deification when an individual, nation, or civilization turns away from God. That which is not God will become as God and will assume the aura of godhood. One of those things that are not God is sex. When Israel turned away from God, sex, in the form of the goddess Ashtoreth or Ishtar, was deified. Sex became a god. Sex thus became an end and a goal to be pursued in and of itself. Therefore, it could now be divorced from marriage or any other context and be followed with no regard for context or any other thing. When the spirit of Ishtar came to America, the same dynamics began to replay. Sexuality was deified. It became a god to be pursued as an end in and of itself, and without regard to marriage, love, or even a relationship. That which was once the exclusive domain of husband and wife now spilled into the public sphere and popular culture. And so began the progressive severing of sexuality from marriage. As Israel worshipped and served the goddess of sexuality, so now America, indwelt by the same spirit and the same goddess, became increasingly obsessed with sex. The destruction of marriage. Though Ishtar was involved in the ritualized marriage ceremonies of Mesopotamian religion, and though some of her myths involved a form of marriage, there was almost nothing about her that was conducive to marriage. Just the opposite. Her nature and acts, her worship and cult, would undermine it. She was never faithful. She was promiscuous. She pursued and seduced lover after lover. She pursued sexual relations apart from marriage and to the detriment of marriage. So the effect of Ishtar's return to the modern world was the progressive undermining and weakening of marriage. As sexuality was glorified as an end in and of itself, marriage was eroded. As Ishtar had pursued relationship after relationship, so America began doing the same. As the taboo against ending one's marriage began to end, so did marriages. Under the spirit of Ishtar, divorce became an epidemic, and America was filled with broken homes. Passions of the goddess. Ishtar was led only by her will and desires. She had no regard for the consequences of her actions. The idea of denying her desires for the sake of a covenant was to her an anathema. She sought the immediate fulfillment of every impulse. She was the goddess of instant gratification. So with the return of Ishtar, American and modern culture became consumed with instant gratification. Americans increasingly chose their desires over relationships, over preserving their marriages or entering into them in the first place. A culture of hyper-individualism, self, and self-gratification proved to be toxic to marriage and relationships. As it was Ishtar's nature to choose sexual pleasure and romance over commitment, more and more Americans did likewise. They slept with each other, lived with each other, but would not commit to each other. Marriage, as a lifelong covenant, was increasingly viewed as an unnecessary constraint. What was once fornication now became premarital relations, and in time, the norm. The number of Americans living together without marriage and the number of children born out of wedlock or without fathers would skyrocket. Ishtar in Hollywood. The realms of entertainment and popular culture were subject to the same spirit. The codes and standards that had been established to serve as moral hedges were now removed. What was once forbidden, abhorrent, or taboo now filled movie screens. And whereas the television industry once avoided showing married couples in bed, now it regularly portrayed unmarried people in bed and having sex with multiple partners. And whereas nudity was once never seen in public, it was now displayed on movie screens and piped into American living rooms. If Americans from the 1950s had turned on their television sets to see what would appear on the nation's television sets years into the future, they would not have been able to process it. It would have appeared to them as something out of the apocalypse or a dark fever dream. That was how radically effective the work of the goddess had been. The taboo. Ishtar's nature was to trespass boundaries, transgress convention, and break taboos. So American culture became possessed by a spirit of transgression, a drive to push the next boundary, to transgress the next convention, to break the next taboo. What was once abhorrent now became a source of pleasure. And it was not only the taking of pleasure in sin, but in the breaking of taboos and the overturning of the next standard. It was the pleasure of defilement and desecration. Not only did Ishtar introduce, promulgate, and champion sexual immorality, she sanctified it. She declared it holy. Sexually immoral acts were part of her cult and worship, performed as rites in her temples and shrines. So in the grip of her spirit, the same thing began manifesting in American and Western culture. Sexual immorality was now not only accepted, but treated as sacred. Sanctifying the forbidden. Now, it was the former standards and restraints that were seen as sinful, puritanical, repressive, and evil. And the one who opposed the newly sanctified sins or failed to adequately revere them was now treated as something of a heretic, and the opposition to the new morality as something akin to blasphemy. What the spirit of Baal had begun, the spirit of Ashtoreth or Ishtar had taken to another level. The work of each god was to bring about the inversion of civilization. Ishtar had inverted the realm of sexuality. She had taken what was forbidden, unspoken, and taboo, and step by step introduced it into the mainstream culture. The shock of each step would be followed by familiarity and numbness, then toleration, then acceptance, and then celebration. At the end of the process, Americans would be championing what they had once forbidden and forbidding what they had once championed. Ishtar's realm was most critical. It was from sexuality that came marriage, family, society, civilization, and life. And so the workings of the goddess would produce the most profound of transformations in American, Western, and world civilization. She would alter them beyond recognition. She would alter life itself. Could that which now saturates the world of entertainment, drives major portions of the American economy, and floods the World Wide Web, go back to a mystery contained in the tablets of ancient Mesopotamia? Chapter 20. The Sacred Prostitute. Ishtar was the patron goddess of prostitutes. She was their protector, their encourager, their supporter, their guide, and their matron. From the ladies of the night who walked the streets of Sumer to the sacred prostitutes who inhabited the shrines and temples of Babylonia, they all looked to Ishtar, prayed to her, worshipped her, and were her servants. Prostitution was a part of her cult. Sexual acts attended her worship and rituals and could be found in her sanctuaries. The temples of Ishtar were famous for their connection to prostitutes, and even for the business of prostitution. The connection was intrinsic to the goddess's identity. The harlot goddess. Ishtar was not only the great benefactor of prostitutes, but their role model. Her obsession with sexuality, her promiscuity, her countless relationships and lovers, all of these served as examples for the ancient Middle Eastern prostitute. In the tablets of Sumer, Ishtar, or her earlier incarnation as Inanna, is described as a harimtu or karkid. The words are commonly translated as prostitute. Some argue that the words can mean prostitute, but not necessarily in every context. But the word words appear in descriptions of Ishtar, where the context clearly refers to prostitution, specifically when it cites the tavern, the place where ancient hymn says this: "They cannot compete with you, Inanna, Ishtar. As a prostitute, you go down to the tavern, and like a ghost who slips in through the window, you enter there." And from another: "You, my lady, dress like one of no repute in a single garment." As the ancient Mesopotamian prostitute could be identified by her jewelry, so too Ishtar. The pearls of a prostitute are placed around your neck. Another ancient tribute to the goddess is even more detailed, as it deals with the pricing of her trade. "When I stand against the wall, it is 1 shekel." Another ancient inscription has the goddess saying outright, "I am a prostitute." The sexualization of American culture. The return of Ishtar was the return of the prostitute goddess. It would set in motion a transformation based on the dynamics of her trade as well as her cult of worship. Prostitution takes sexual relations out of the exclusive context of husband and wife and brings them into the larger culture, into the marketplace, the realm of trade and commerce. Likewise, Ishtar's cult of worship took sexuality out of the private realm of the marriage covenant and into the public realm of festivals, rituals, and temple worship. So when the spirit of Ishtar returned to Western civilization, it worked toward removing sexuality from the bounds of marriage. Sexuality now moved out of the private realm and into the public realm. What had once been the exclusive possession of husband and wife within the covenant of marriage now became the possession of the larger culture, popular culture, and public life. So American and Western culture became sexualized. Its sexuality had been stolen from the marriage bed. Sexuality was now everywhere and unbridled by the covenant of marriage. The harlot's pay. It was not only that Ishtar's prostitutes would take sexuality out of the marriage bed and into the streets of Sumer and Akkad, they would bring it into the marketplace. They converted it into a commodity to be bought and sold. In prostitution, sex was employed as a means of procuring money. So upon her return, not only did the prostitute goddess flood the culture with sexuality, but she increasingly employed it in the marketplace as a commodity. Sex would increasingly be used to procure money on movie screens, in music videos, in magazines, on the internet, and wherever else it could generate money. What the spirit of Ishtar had promoted in the cities of Mesopotamia, it now promoted in America and world culture. Sex was monetized. The pornification of culture. It was not only that sex was used to sell other commodities, but, as in Ishtar's ancient craft, sex itself was up for sale. Industries that had existed in the shadows now entered the American and Western mainstream and were normalized. Adult magazines, adult clubs, adult movies, adult entertainment increased in numbers and influence. One no longer had to venture into the corners and shadows of American life.